The Nikon Z9 is almost a year old now, but Nikon is making it new again by releasing version 3 of their firmware, and it includes some huge changes, especially to address problems that we brought up with earlier firmware versions. So we're retesting it to find out if this could be the camera of the year, but also will we switch from the Sony A1 over to the Nikon Z9 now that it has some improvements. The most important improvements are, for one, zoom within video, a virtual zoom. So even if you're using a prime lens, it will now crop in from full frame down to up to 2 times. And it does so really nicely and smoothly. And this adds so much versatility for video shooters. It does have a limitation. It only works at 4K at 30 frames per second, but I think that's a huge value add for any sort of video shooter. For sports and wildlife shooters, they're adding a 60 frames per second mode that falls nicely between the existing 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second. Now, this is unique in that this is an APS-C crop. It's shooting 19 megapixel JPEG only images at 60 frames per second using their pre-capture. So you can set up the pre-capture to actually go back in time. This is so useful for what I'm doing right now, which is photographing shorebirds, pulling fish out of the water. And if you've ever photographed these birds, you know that they successfully pull a fish out of the water, sometimes 1 out of 10 times, 1 out of 20 times. So you have to be patient and wait for them to get lucky. But the human reaction time is about 1/4 of a second. So if you wait until after they pull the fish up to press the shutter, you'll miss it. They'll have already swallowed it. So every time they hit the water, you have to start shooting before they come up just to be sure you capture that moment. With the pre-capture, you don't have to do that. I can wait until he hits the water and I see a fish in the bill, and then I push the shutter and the camera goes back in time and captures the whole thing, factoring out the human reaction time. It is so incredibly useful. And in my experience, it is working great. It's the perfect setup for this type of shooting.
When you turn on the new 60 frames per second mode, the Z9 switches from a 45 megapixel full frame camera to a 19 megapixel APS-C camera. For sports, that might not be acceptable, but for wildlife where you often end up cropping anyway, it's a pretty good deal. There's a crazy side effect to 60 frames per second mode that Nikon didn't tell us about, and that's amazing autofocus. Here, in 20 frames per second mode, you do not see the yellow subject detection box. It is not finding the animal. Switch to 60 frames per second, and bam, it locks right on. Over and over and over again, 20 frames per second autofocus failed where it worked in 60 frames per second mode. This is probably because the sensor is reading out less than half the data and refreshing at twice the speed. How good is this autofocus? I think it's as good as a Sony A1 and better than a Canon R5. Now, you only get this when you're shooting in APS-C mode, and it's JPEG only, no RAW files. But Nikon made the best APS-C wildlife camera ever made. The downside is it's huge and $5,500. But if you want an APS-C camera and you have the budget, this is the way to go. Let's jump into Lightroom and look at a couple of 60 frames per second examples. First, you can see I've taken almost 42,000 pictures with the Z9 because these high frame rates can be difficult to manage. If you look at the beginning of the sequence, you can see a whole series of pictures out of focus. The bird was in focus when I first pressed the shutter, which might have been around here, but the camera goes back in time to a point before it was in focus. As I progress through these pictures, you can see the Nikon did a pretty good job of focusing, though these are a little bit back focused on the feathers. But I had a hard time keeping the bird in the frame. This is a disadvantage of being forced into APS-C mode. The heavy crop means it's more difficult to find and keep birds in the frame. If I were shooting in full frame mode, I could have cropped these later and had those pictures intact. Some people will say, who needs 60 frames per second? That's too much. Well, animals are constantly moving, and the slight variation between frames can produce a noticeably better picture. Like some of these frames, you can't even tell what's in the heron's mouth, but as I move forward, you can see the fish change its position. Here, the bird throws it in the air, making a much more interesting composition. At 20 frames per second, I would only have 1 out of 3 of these frames available to choose from. The other big disadvantage of this mode is that you can't shoot RAW, it's JPEG only, and that means you have to be very precise with your exposure. This might be the best frame, but the fish is so wet and reflective that it is wildly overexposed, and I cannot recover those blown out highlights from a JPEG. I could from a RAW, however. I also discovered a serious bug when using 60 frames per second APS-C mode. When you're in shutter priority, it will pick a higher than necessary aperture and thus a higher than necessary ISO, reducing the image quality significantly. At times it even picked f22. Now once I noticed this, I switched to manual mode and selected f4, but this means in good lighting conditions the camera would not adjust the aperture to prevent overexposure. I hope Nikon fixes this bug soon.
It's also perfect for sports shooters who usually have to proactively just lean on the shutter, hoping that they capture the decisive moment. But with athletes constantly juking and faking you out, you end up wasting a lot of frames. Now you can wait until you know that a goal actually hit before you press the shutter. Great feature, Nikon. Maybe the most important improvement are improvements to the autofocus, both 3D tracking and subject detection. Now, in our previous tests, we ran across some serious problems with both of those. Specifically, the Nikon couldn't track faraway birds, which made it difficult to get a subject in focus before it was flying close to you. If you're not a wildlife photographer, you might not understand that you have to get a bird in focus when it's far away in order to get those close-up flying bird shots, because you track it as it gets closer. It's almost impossible to find a close-up bird flying in the frame. With this version of the firmware, they said they've improved that, and indeed, I am finding subjects that are small in the frame seem to be tracking much better. But as soon as the subject flies in front of trees, the autofocus tends to jump to the background. It's been hit or miss. Sometimes it works great, and other times it just fails me completely. So I have to say that aspect of it is still behind Sony and Canon pretty far. Now, when I was at the feeder photographing more still subjects in more controlled conditions, it actually felt like a regression to me. It felt worse than firmware version 2.0. I had a very difficult time getting 3D tracking to lock onto foreground subjects, which is weird because the firmware update notes say that that is something that they have improved. It should be better, but it actually seems to have gotten significantly worse, to the point where almost every time I needed to focus closer, I had to grab the lens and manually focus it to get it close, and then it would lock on. The subject detection was also hit or miss. Anytime it's yellow on the screen, that's when subject detection is working, and anytime it's red, that's when the 3D tracking is working. Both were popping in and out. These frustrations did not stop me from getting great pictures with the Nikon. I've been shooting with it for almost a year now, and I've gotten a whole set of pictures that I'm really proud of. You can definitely make this work, but as camera reviewers, I have to give you an objective comparison to the competition. The Canon R5 from Canon and the Sony A1 from Sony, and those both have superior tracking and subject detection systems at this point in time. But I'm really glad that Nikon keeps updating this camera, and I can't wait to see what firmware 4.0 looks like. Thanks, Nikon.